My name is Don Linky. This is another in the series of interviews for the Rutgers program on the governor, focusing particularly on the career of Governor Brendan T. Byrne. Today is May 15, 2006. Our guest today is William Faherty, who's been a prominent figure in New Jersey politics, government, and business for many years, encompassing the Byrne administration and earlier and later administrations in New Jersey. He has served as a deputy mayor of Trenton, as a deputy commissioner of banking and insurance, as president of the New Jersey State Chamber of Commerce, and established the first government banking division at a major New Jersey bank, which has had various transformations over the years and different names, but at one time was one of the premier and largest banks doing business in New Jersey. And we're here today to sort of discuss Mr. Faherty's relationships with various governors, but particularly Governor Brendan Byrne. Bill, over your long and varied career in New Jersey, I'd sort of like you to reflect on how has New Jersey changed in government, politics, business, demographically, and from a development standpoint. And also sort of looking back, do you think New Jersey now is better than when you sort of have your earliest memories, or is it worse or somewhere in between?
I'm an optimist. I think it's better, although it's much bigger. When I first started, right out of Rutgers University, and it was a smaller division in the city of Trenton, Patterson, Newark, Elizabeth, Camden. In fact, Art Holland, who was the mayor at that time, started the conference of big mayors, just the big city mayors. But now, today, it's much, much larger, and there are more problems. The problems today were not the problems that we had. First of all, the big problem with children in those days was smoking. Unfortunately, today, Don, it's drugs and many other things. So it has really changed the situation, but I'm an optimist. I still think that government and business and industry, although we've lost a lot of it over the last 35 years, I still think we have great cities, we have great towns, municipalities, and I think we're a great state.
What about politics? We hear today a lot of criticism about how partisan politics is today, not only in New Jersey, but nationally. We also hear about how much money has become so significant in politics. And I guess we also hear that the quality of people who are going into public service today may not be quite the caliber of those that went into it, say, 20, 30, even 40 years ago. Do you sort of agree with that, or what are your views on how politics has changed?
It has changed. We never had the large amounts of money to be raised, either with Arthur Holland on a local level or Governor Hughes on a state level. We raised a lot of money, but not in the amounts they raise today. Do I think the government is better as far as the people are concerned? The candidates are excellent today, and I think in time, I think we've gotten better candidates over the years since I've been here, active.
What about the business community? When you were active as president of the State Chamber of Commerce, and before that in your banking career, the state was probably a lot sort of more collegial, more insular in terms of the relationships among the political and business and social establishment. But that has changed today, and is that for the better or worse?
Well, I like the old days then, when we had the Five Bobs, for example, in Newark. You could call on the Five Bobs. In fact, Brendan Byrne a couple times had breakfast meetings with Bob Ferguson, my boss at First National State Bank, Bob Beck of Prudential, Bob Van Fossen of Mutual Benefit Life, Bob Van Buren of Mid-Atlantic, who was then National Newark and Essex, and Bob Smith of Public Service. those 5 Bobs could be called anytime, and that almost within 24 hours they could meet, and they did meet with many times with Governor Byrne.
And that has changed today, I guess.
Oh, drastically.
There aren't 5 people you could identify in that similar role today.
Unfortunately, no, because of the mergers. Our bank, for example, at one time, First National State Bank of New Jersey was the largest bank in the state. Today, it is a large bank, but we are now a conglomerate. We're a bank which has its headquarters, and it's a great bank, Wachovia, in North Carolina. But we're not a New Jersey homegrown bank anymore.
Right.
We're part of a big picture, and that is a difficult situation. We don't have that Bob Ferguson you could go to overnight.
And of course, part of it is deregulation. In the older days, banks, public utilities, insurance companies probably had more of their self-interest tied up in Trenton because it was a regulated industry, and some of the decisions that were made in the Department of Banking and Insurance or the Public Utilities Commission had impact on the bottom line for those companies, so they paid attention, they were active, and they wanted to be good citizens.
1,000% correct. I can remember when I started with the First National State Bank of New Jersey in Newark, we couldn't branch outside of the county. That's Essex County. And I worked very hard with the late Commissioner Charles R. Howe, when I was Deputy Commissioner of Bank Insurance, to pass the bill to have statewide banking. After I left, Governor Cahill and his administration passed that bill that we wrote, and we now have statewide banking. That opened up tremendous volumes of new banks that we could acquire and become a much bigger bank and help the people of New Jersey.
And you also mentioned that we're a lot bigger state now. We're the most densely populated state in the country. Do you sort of have fonder memories for the old days when we had more farms, when we had more open space, and we had less development? Or is it something you think was just inevitable and that we have to sort of deal with the times as they are?
Unfortunately, we have to deal with the times. And I was born and raised in Hopewell, New Jersey, on my grandfather's farm, 50 Princeton Avenue. It's still there, but it's not a farm anymore. It's now a cluster of housing. And but this is what happens, and I'm a great believer in progress, and I think we're doing a good job in New Jersey.
Well, I think that's a nice opening to sort of talk about your childhood and early upbringing on that farm. Why don't you expand a little bit about your sort of earliest memories on that farm in Hopewell?
Well, unfortunately, it's a very sad memory, I think, of my grandfather's farm. On that farm, the Lindbergh baby was kidnapped, and his body was discovered about 1.5 miles up the road on Grandpop's farm.
Oh, really?
And it was a terrible situation, a terrible tragedy. But that was the sad news. But I love that farm. I mean, we had cows and we had no horses, but we had the pigs and the chickens and everything else. Today, they don't have that type of thing.
And did you work actively in
Oh, no,
farming?
I was a kid.
So
I
but
went
they
to
didn't put
Hopewell.
you to work on the tractor or the plow? Or?
No. In fact, Grandpop had people to do that for him. He was a railroader on the old Reading line. But I went to school right across the street, the Hopewell Grammar School. It's still there. Went with the Breckingers. They were the big builders in those days, and the son of the minister, I can't think of his name, Richard, Reverend Richard's son.
Well, before we leave this little piece of history, what memories do you have of that Lindbergh kidnapping and finding of the baby on your grandfather's farm?
Well, it was in those days, Colonel Lindbergh, who lived up in the Sorrow Mountains, we didn't have a post office in downtown Hopewell, my apology. He had to go to Princeton, and almost every day he had his driver take him right past our home. And my father had bought me a little airplane you get in and you pedal, and it had Lindy on the side. He stopped one day and gave me his hat.
Oh, really?
I'm sorry, I don't know where that hat is today, but this is before the tragedy that struck the family. but I have pleasant memories. And I'll never forget, this was during the Depression years, and my father was offered a job in Trenton, New Jersey, as city assessor for the city of Trenton. And I came home from school one day, walked right across the street. My mother was crying. And I said, "Mom, what's the problem?" She says, "I'm crying tears of joy. We're moving back to Trenton," where she originally from. Her father was the first automobile dealer in the city of Trenton, John Toman. And I said, "We're moving where?" "We're moving to Trenton, New Jersey." And then I started to cry.
Before we leave the Lindbergh case, was there a lot of flurry of activity after the baby was discovered?
Thousands, and I literally mean thousands of people from all over the country. The license plates we used to watch go up and down the road, especially on the weekends, and they wanted to know the exact location. Well, somehow they found out there was an exact location there, but people from all over especially the eastern part of the United States, wanted to see where that baby was found.
And were they like trying to take souvenirs from the
Not
farm?
really,
No.
not really, no. He was found in an area where they just covered the body with leaves.
And how did you how old were you at the time?
Approximately 8 years old.
So how did that sort of impact on you? Did that have any lasting impressions of the sort of
No.
violent, famous crime?
Not really, not really. Naturally, when I used to read, when I got older and read the various articles that were put in Saturday Evening Post and Look magazine and Life magazine of the old days of Lindbergh kidnapping and the terrible gentleman who they claim who did it, Bruno Hauptmann, who was, by the way, put to death at the New Jersey State Prison. I'll never forget that night because Gabriel Heater, a famous radio announcer from WOR, came down, and he had a nationwide audience at that time, and he described the death of Bruno Hauptmann.
Now, did you and your grandfather and the rest of the family follow the Hauptmann trial very closely?
My father did. I was only 8 years old. My father, I think, and his brothers followed the trial, but that's about it.
Okay. All right. Well, now you're moving to Trenton,
Yeah.
which is dividing the family's loyalties, I guess, a little bit. What was Trenton like in those days?
Oh, it was great. We had a semi-detached home at 878 Parkside Avenue, which is just about 1 block from Cadwalder Park, the main park. And it was fantastic. We rode this Blessed Sacrament Grammar School. We went to, my father believed in, because we were Catholic, 8 years of Catholic education. And if you didn't know your Catholic religion after 8 years, forget about it. Because he felt that we should go to public high school, and all our children went to public high school, because he felt we were going to meet all types of men and women in the future years, and he believed in public education in high school.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said your mother was originally from Trenton.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about how the earlier members of the family came to this country and where they settled, and how many sort of different places did they disperse to?
Well, Grandpa Faherty and his wife naturally didn't have an education. They came over from Ireland in the late 1800s and settled. Every Irishman, as I understood it from my dad and his brothers, wanted to own land. They loved the soil. And of course, my grandfather didn't have the farm when he came over here. He was a railroader, and he married a young lady from the area, an Irish lady who had come over also with her family. And they had a small farm. So their parents died. He inherited the small farm, and then later became a much larger farm.
When you say he was a railroader, what did he do?
Yeah, he was the foreman on the old Reading Railroad, which ran from New York City to Washington, D.C. And the famous train was the Senator. Mm-hmm. And that was the famous train. All the politicians that took down, at that time, the Reading Railroad was a very famous railroad. They had many stops. One was in Hopewell, New Jersey. The station is still there.
Mm-hmm. Did he sort of naturally take to farming, or was it a chore for him to learn the
No,
craft?
he was a natural.
He liked it.
Oh, he loved it. He loved it.
And how about you? Did you sort of like the farm chores, the early mornings, the 7 days a week
Well, I can
schedule?
remember we didn't have plumbing in those days, you know, and I never knew what a toilet was, believe it or not, and we had an outhouse. And I remember when we came to Trenton, we had plumbing. I couldn't believe it. I mean, it was a whole new life.
Now, Trenton at that time was a very industrial city,
Oh.
very active and sort of prosperous economically, I think.
Trenton, New Jersey was at one time the capital of the rubber industry in the world, and also the Lenox China and the famous China, the Scammell China. John A. Roebling's sons, the builders of the Brooklyn Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge, the George Washington Bridge, employed over 7,000 people in Trenton in their plants. Established Chambersburg, New Jersey. Some of the most famous Italian-American families, not only in Trenton, came out of Chambersburg, but their fathers worked at the plants at John A. Roebling.
Even though you were pretty young when you moved, did you get this feel that this city was sort of thriving and that economically it was one of the most prominent in the country?
Positively. We had 3 newspapers at the time. It was just a very good place to live and a healthy place to live. The environment was great.
Now, did your father sell the farm when he moved into Trenton and got the job in the government?
My grandfather left it to my brother. My grandfather's name was Patrick Henry Faherty, and my brother's name was Patrick Henry Faherty. And guess who got the farm? My brother. And my brother sold the farm, but divided the goods to all of us.
Within the family, did you think that naming was a coincidence or a conspiracy?
Oh no. They wanted to. My father and mother wanted to name my second brother Patrick Henry Faherty, who's now retired and was a great educator at Lawrence High School in outside of Trenton, New Jersey.
Now, how did it come that your father did get the appointment in Trenton?
Well, he did a lot of appraising for the state of New Jersey during the Depression years. And as you know, we didn't have many major highways in those days. And we didn't have the federal highway system being built. That was under the Eisenhower administration. But we had state highways that had to go through different lands, and my father became an appraiser and made some money from the state as an appraiser. And as an appraiser in his background, he became certified over the years. He became an expert, and city assessor was a perfect opportunity. He only held that job for about 4 years, and then he got a break. He took over a savings loan that was on its way out, and it was called the United Savings Loan at 114 North Montgomery Street. It became New Jersey's first federally insured savings loan. That's how he worked very hard. Unfortunately, they didn't have the great medicines they have today. And at the age of 49, he died of a heart attack within 3 hours.
Yeah. In getting this sort of assessor's job, I think you've sort of suggested that it was pretty much on merit, that he knew what he was doing.
Oh, yes.
And he was sort of viewed as doing or knowing his stuff, so that appointment was natural. But was there any politics involved? Did he know people who were helpful?
I'm so young I don't remember that. I'm sure that he probably knew the commissioner. In those days it was a commission form of government, and we were one of the first cities to have the commission form of government, which was established in 1913. 5 city commissioners. I'm sure he knew the commissioner of finance were the assessor, but I don't know who the commissioner of finance. It might have been Mr. Waldron, but I'm not sure.
Okay, so now you moved to Trenton. I assume you're going to public school in Trenton.
Well, I went to yes, you're right. I went to Catholic school for a number of years, but the last 4 years at high school, Trenton High School, great high school. We graduated in my year in 1944 1,190 students, and we had our graduation at the War Memorial Building in Trenton, New Jersey. Unbelievable.
We'll talk a little bit more about what it was like to go to school in Trenton, both in Catholic schools as well as the public system.
Well, the nuns were excellent teachers. We had Franciscans at that time. There were different orders in different schools, but we had the Franciscans. They were excellent teachers, very strict. I mean, you couldn't fool around. And if you did fool around, you go in a cloakroom, put out your hands, and wham! They don't do that today, but they were very strict, but they were good teachers, and most of the kids were good kids, and they obeyed them. But Trenton High School was unbelievable. It was a small university. And you say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, we had teachers who were really could be college professors. That's how good they were. Mr. Kirkpatrick, one of the greatest Latin teachers probably in the history of the state of New Jersey. Mr. Manzer in chemistry, one of the great chemistry teachers in New Jersey. But they were top flight teachers, and I can tell you out of the graduating class of those children going on to college, 90% of our class went to college. Unbelievable.
Both in school and the city as a whole, what was the general ethnic makeup of the neighborhoods and the school system? You talked about the Italians and the Irish.
Yeah.
Let's go through the
That's
various
excellent.
minorities.
That's excellent. You know, growing up, we never thought of this, but when you got older, you found, in Chambersburg, near the John A. Roebling plant, which is in the center of town, Central's, that was the Italian-American community. The Polish community was in North Trenton, St. Hedwig's Parish, where the Kolonowskis and the Tysowskis lived, and prominent in political life in Trenton. In North Trenton also there was a hotbed of Irish. In South Trenton we had the Polish, the Hungarians, the Slavics. In those days, the black community, and of course in those days they were called Negroes. In my graduating class in Trenton High in 1944, I think we had, probably about 20. But we had those 20 men and women, most of them became professionals. One of the greatest friends I've ever had was Mel Grooms, who later became All-American University of Indiana and one of the great coaches of one of the black colleges in the South, North Carolina A&T.
At that time, did the various ethnic communities pretty much stick together, the Irish, the Italians, the African Americans?
Yeah, because they all had soccer teams. They all had soccer teams. And every Saturday and Sunday they played those games, and it was always, but there was no fights or anything like that.
What about at Trenton High? Was there people just...
No, people blended in.
They blended in.
Oh, yeah. It was unbelievable. I mean, that's a very good question, because they took kids from all over the city of Trenton, and they blended in. They became one. It was a great experience for them and for all of us.
Okay. Any other memories of Trenton High you want to share before we move on?
No, that's about it. Okay. Great school.
Well, as you're nearing graduation, what are your thoughts about what you're going to do next?
Well, unfortunately, I had a problem. Even though they had these great professors and I was there, I didn't obtain enough credits to go to a major college. I could have gone to a minor college, but my father really wanted me to go to a place like Boston College or Rutgers University or something like that. I couldn't make Rutgers or Boston College, although I played a lot of football. And so I took a year of prep school. My father had on his board the Reverend J. Lawrence Pitt, who was a Methodist minister, one of the biggest Methodist churches in Trenton area. And the Reverend J. Lawrence Pitt was, after he left the ministry, became assistant headmaster at Pennington Prep. Pennington Prep being a Methodist school, still is today, the Methodist Conference. So I went there, but my father and Reverend Pitt said, "Bill, you're going to stay here." I never went home during the week. I had to stay at that school in Pennington, New Jersey. It changed my whole life. because at Trenton High we had classes of 45 to 55. You were called in maybe once a month. At Pennington Prep, I'll never forget, I didn't prepare the first day. I walked into class, we had 8 kids. I was called every day. Guess what? I learned to study. I graduated out of 93, I graduated number 3 and got a full scholarship to one of the greatest universities I've ever, I think, in the world, and that's Rutgers University.
And what was sort of Rutgers like? Was that intimidating as you sort of enrolled as a freshman?
Oh, yes. Oh, very much so. It was, well, one of the things was freedom. I mean, you're on your own. I've never been on my own, you know, when you grow up with your family. But it was great. It was fantastic. I lived in one of the dormitories, and in fact, my senior year, I was a proctor in one of the dormitories.
Of course, it was a much smaller school at that time and much closer to a sort of elite Ivy University or equivalent.
A lot of people thought Rutgers was an Ivy League school. Of course, it's not. But we had, I would say, about 3,800 students. And today they have, I don't know, 50 or 80,000. I don't know how many they have.
What were the subjects you were most interested in?
I wanted to be, I don't know, I wanted to take a pre-med course. It was a little too tough for me. And I graduated, and I'm very happy that I did, because I made some good marks and became a teacher. That was my background.
Was that something that your family encouraged, or were they looking for you to be a doctor or a lawyer?
No, not really. No, no pressure at all. It was my advisors at Rutgers felt that I should do this, and I did it.
Any sort of key teachers at Rutgers that you remember who were great influences?
Yeah, Professor Laurentis in German. And this is a funny story. This is when I was in pre-med. After the first, at a certain time you have to get out before you get a knee or a failure. And I became very friendly with Professor Laurentis. He said, "Mr. Faherty, you and German were not meant to be together." And that's my story. Yes, I have. No, there are other stories, but so one of the great football stories. I mean, I played football with some of the greatest men ever came out of Rutgers. Frank Burns, former head football coach, he was our quarterback. Bucky Hatchett, a great all-East end from Verona, New Jersey. Hank Pryor, great halfback from Columbia High School. Harvey Grimsley, I think Harvey is from Erwin Rinkelried from Southside Newark. I think Harvey was from one of those Newark schools. But we had unbelievable teams. Okie Pandak was our left tackle. Frank Throp, left tackle. Right tackle, Bill Faherty. Bob Oakes, very active at Rutgers, became head of security years and years afterwards. We had a gentleman from the Air Force, I can't think of his name, he was 35 years old, can you imagine? And was the first team center, Ernie Gardner.
Did you have any trouble sort of balancing your football and your studies?
Yeah, I think everybody goes through that, but you learn to balance it. Everyone goes through that situation where, sometimes you get caught up with football so much you forget to study. But yeah, they took good care of us here.
Now, did you have any thought about after graduation going into banking at that point? Or?
Oh no, I became a teacher in the Trenton school system, and I was there for about junior high school #1, and I had a great experience for a year. But then I had offered a position as assistant director of recreation for the city of Trenton under the late George Riker. He was a city commissioner, a friend of my dad's, and I got the job, and I really loved it. And then I became very active in the city, coaching and establishing Little League Baseball. Our department, and I brought Carl Stotts, who from Williamsport, Pennsylvania, brought him to Trenton, and we established the first Little League baseball team in the city, and out of that came 6 teams: North Trenton, South Trenton, East Trenton, West Trenton, Chambersburg, and many of those leagues are still there, and the fields are still there.
So as you're sort of working in recreation, you're, I assume, developing wider contacts within the city and sort of the government and politics.
And I
too.
did. Not politics, but I established a lot of business relationships. I met men like Fred Schluter, who's, by the way, whose son became a state senator, and a great state senator. But Fred Schluter was president and CEO of Thermoid Rubber Company. Remember I mentioned the rubber companies here, the rubber capital of the world? And Mr. Schluter also was the head of the Boys Clubs of Trenton. And since I was in recreation, I met Red Smith, Leroy Red Smith, who was one of the great basketball coaches, not only in this state, but the nation. Trenton High was known for its basketball teams. And there was an opening as executive director of the Boys Clubs of Trenton, and they asked me to come down and take a look at it, and I fell in love with it overnight. They put me through NYU, a short course. It took about 9 weeks, and I became the youngest executive director of any boys clubs in America. Today it's boys and girls clubs, but this time it was just Boys Clubs of Trenton.
How old were you at that time?
32. And that's, now this turns me into politics because I needed a piano. And I was very friendly with Jim Kearney, the owner and publisher of the Trenton Times newspapers, and he would put little boxes on the front page for YMCA or the Boys Club. Well, Boys Club needs piano. Guess who calls me? A man by the name of Arthur Holland, Deputy Commissioner of Public Affairs for the City of Trenton. He asked me to join him at Don Linky Memorial Hospital, which was the city hospital at the time. It's now run by Mercer County. And they had 4 or 5 pianos, which they were going to give away, and you can have one of the pianos. So that's how I met Arthur Holland, and then my whole life changed, because 4 years later I became his campaign manager, and we defeated a mayor who was there for 28 years, a very fine gentleman, Donald J. Conley, and Arthur Holland. I think, of course I'm prejudiced, but I think in my lifetime I will never meet a more honest and dedicated person as that man, Arthur Holland. He later became president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and I'm very proud and happy that our mayor of the city of Trenton is going to become also next year the president of the Conference of Mayors, the present mayor.
Expand on those.
Doug Palmer.
Sure. Expand on those sort of 4 years before Arthur Holland runs for mayor and is elected. Your relationship obviously grew closer. What were you doing? Were you helping him sort of organize politically? Was it more just a friendship?
Friendship. I never involved the Boys Clubs of Trenton in my life in volunteering or going to meetings, political meetings with Arthur Holland. He was a deputy commissioner then. He wasn't mayor. But when he decided to run for mayor, I asked my board if I could be of help, and they felt that almost to a man that it would be okay, and never thinking I'd become deputy mayor after he was elected. I was not his first choice, by the way. His first choice was a wonderful man, Jim Davison, but he had a great job, and he didn't want to give up a job for the salary of deputy mayor, which is practically nothing.
And this
at that time.
This is pretty much your first sort of political experience in managing.
Oh, I had no
campaign.
political experience until I worked with Arthur Holland. It was unbelievable. I mean, today, people, pay to play and all that. Arthur Holland did by the book. Like in the last general election, the first general election we worked in, we could only spend 10 cents per person. That was the federal law, and it became a state law, and he abided by that. I'll tell you a great story. John A. Roebling Sons Corporation. Charles Tyson was the president and CEO, and Earl Conover was the executive vice president. They thought so much of Arthur Holland that they called me down one day, and I've never seen, each of the 12 men gave me $100, not, in an envelope. And I said, what's this for? This is for, oh, I said, I've never seen so much money in my life. I said, we can't take, what do you mean you can't take it? Arthur says you must use your name. I've got to print every one of your names, and you got to give me a check. Forget about it. You know what they did that day, that day of election? All 12 of them, these are CEOs, executive vice presidents of Johnny Roby. They took their automobiles out and brought people, we assigned them all over the city of Trenton, and took people to the polls. Mm-hmm. That's how much they thought of Arthur Holland.
Talk a little bit about the sort of Trenton political structure at that time as Art Holland sort of prepares his campaign. Who was in power? Who were the sort of key figures both in and behind the government?
Well, it was a tough campaign. There was a paving monopoly. There was a couple of paving firms in New Jersey. They don't have to be mentioned because they're gone now. But they got all the jobs in Newark and Patterson and Trenton and so forth. And somehow bids always were, you know, they would have outside bidders come in, but they would always win the bid because they put the low bid in and had the other. Well, Arthur decided to check to see the specifications of the paving, what's on the streets, if it was okay. You know, we had certain specifications. And our specifications in Trenton were trap rock. You had to have trap rock in your asphalt. Guess what? We went out one night and dug up 3 streets. Little holes, and had them analyzed by Jersey testing. And it came back that they weren't using trap rock. They were using a cheaper dolomite. Mm-hmm. Well, that exploded, and one of the reasons, one of many reasons why the mayor became and upset Donald J. Conley, mm-hmm. who, by the way, was a very fine gentleman.
Mm-hmm. When you sort of managed the campaign, what were the things that you did best and worst?
Worst was raising money because I couldn't raise too much money. I wanted to raise money, but he would not allow it. The best was the volunteers. We had the greatest volunteer army of people that this city has ever known. I mean, we had 14 wards at the time. They only have 4 wards now. But we had 14 wards. And we had, for example, our 14th ward leader was Bill Borden, the late Bill Borden. Mm-hmm. Bill Borden was chairman of the state Republican Party. Mm-hmm. And we had people who were Democrats, because it was a nonpartisan election. It still is nonpartisan, like Newark. Newark is nonpartisan. But Arthur Holland kept it nonpartisan. The Democratic Party at that time, Mercer County, tried to get in, but they couldn't get in.
How close was the election?
We won probably 2-1. Mm-hmm. And Arthur always ran very, very high, 2-1. He was defeated, though. The darkest day of my life when a young man who I've known from childhood, I mean, he was much younger than I was, but I knew it. I was blocking at Trenton High School playing tackle, and his brother, Fred Armeni, was the running back, and I opened many holes for Fred Armeni to go through and score a touchdown for Trenton High. And sure enough, his younger brother came along, Carmen Armenti, the late Carmen Armenti, very fine young man, and beat us. Mm-hmm. Beat us. There was a reason, many reasons why, but one of the reasons I will say to this day, the people, unfortunately, decided that Arthur had gone too far. What did he do? He moved into a mixed neighborhood. Mm-hmm. He didn't do it purposely. He felt generally that he wanted to do this. And I think there was a backlash.
Mm-hmm. Now, after he gets elected mayor for the first time, did you feel that you wanted to go into government, or did he sort of persuade you, or did you think you'd go back to doing what you had been doing before with the boys' clubs?
I thought I would go back for the boys' clubs, but and I said I wasn't his first choice. And then Jim Davison turned him down. He came to me. We had a talk for a couple hours, and he really felt that he really wanted me. And he told me why he wanted Jim, because of Jim's, quote, business background. He had a great business background, which I didn't at that time.
What were your sort of responsibilities and sort of key memories of being deputy mayor?
I ran a department also, Department of Public Affairs, which had the health department, the recreation department, and things like that.
And did you sort of do assignments as he called for them, things that came up that he thought you could handle, that either he wanted you to focus on, or he didn't have the time personally?
Yeah, if he didn't have the time personally, he always and never resented, because I had my picture in the paper, Trenton Times and the Trentonian, many times when he was busy on other projects, presenting the key to the city of Trenton. Mary Roebling was very, very popular at that time. The leading woman banker in the United States. She was the president of Trenton Trust Company. She had married Siegfried Roebling, and Mary was a very outstanding person, an outstanding banker, and used to have dinner parties at her townhouse. She had one of the most beautiful townhouses, not only in Trenton but throughout the country, on West State Street. And she would sit down 35 people for dinner around a table, and she would have like Vice President Nixon and people like that.
We'll talk a little bit more about the Roeblings that you knew. Who, in addition to Mary Roebling, did you get personal contact with?
See, when I was active, the Roebling family were really not that active. The last active person was Ferd Roebling, and Ferd Roebling was not that active in the company. He was executive vice president, but he was bowing out. The people who were running Roeblings, like Charles Tyson, his mother was a Roebling, you know, and things like that. But the Roebling family, you know, were out of the picture. It was run, and then CF&I from Colorado Fuel and Iron, bought John A. Roebling, and then they changed the whole complex.
And also, I guess, many years before this, one of the Roeblings founded the Mercer Automobile Company, I think around 1910, 1915.
Now, see, I don't know that, but my mother, remember I told you, my grandfather Toman, John Toman, was her first automobile dealer in the city of Trenton. And my mother had a Mercer when she was a young girl.
If you had it today, it'd be worth a lot of money.
A lot of money, a lot of money.
Okay, let's sort of move on, I guess. You're deputy mayor. What's sort of the next sort of milestone in your career?
Well, as I said, one of the sad points in my life when Arthur Holland was defeated. But it also changed my life because I would say within 3 weeks I was offered a position. Mary Roebling offered me a position with her bank, which I thought was great. And then I had a call from Governor Richard J. Hughes, a personal call. Our families were very close. Our girls went to school together at Blessed Sacrament when Dick lived in Trenton before he became governor. And his second wife was wonderful, Betty Sullivan. We knew the Sullivan family. She was also Betty Murphy too, but anyway, Michael Murphy, very active person, is a stepson of Governor Hughes. He called me and asked me to come in to his office and said that there was a position open, Deputy Commissioner of Bank Insurance. So I said, well, you know, Governor, he says, I know what you're going to think. We have experts. We have chief examiners and everything. We need a man who had a great amount of experience in getting things done, and we think, Bill, you can do the job for Charlie Howe, who was then the Commissioner of Bank Insurance, a former congressman, like 4 or 5 terms, and ran for United States Senate against Cliff Case. Thought he had won. We went to bed. He thought he was the next U.S. Senator, and all of a sudden he wasn't, because a lot of votes came out of Atlantic County and he got defeated. But he became Commissioner of Bank Insurance, and I became his Deputy Commissioner. Changed my whole life, because then I met people on a state level.
Expand a little bit more on this sort of relationship with Governor Hughes. How far back did that go, and sort of when that you remember?
Oh, that I remember. I would say it went back to my days of, I would say, about 1950, when it first started.
Of course, his father was warden of Trenton State Prison.
Yeah, and I didn't know his father.
Okay. But did you know his father was the warden?
Yes, and since now you mentioned, I do remember that. And I know Dick Hughes was born and raised in Burlington County. But our family were close because of our children playing together, smaller children.
Was Governor Hughes the first governor you met, or did you meet earlier governors through your position in Trenton?
Governor Hughes was the first one. My father knew Harold Hoffman. He knew Al Driscoll. Bob Miner. Oh, I knew. No, I forget now. I don't know if Miner was before Hughes. I knew. My first real governor was Bob Miner.
And so, what was Governor Miner's like personally? And he was a major contrast, I guess, to Governor Hughes in style and personality.
Oh yeah, much so. Both men were, I think, very, very, and it's a very important thing in politics. They were good, honest men, both of them, but they had different personalities. Bob Miner was kind of a very strict person. Dick Hughes was a jovial person, and but they were very, very good people. I became very close to the state government when I was deputy mayor of Trenton, because I became head of the governmental unit in the United Fund. It's now called the United Way. And when I became head of the governmental unit, that meant I called upon all state employees and county employees in Mercer County, and city employees and employees in other municipalities. So I became very close to the governor and his chief person, whoever that was, to work for the United Way, or the United Fund. That's when I first met Bob Miner. And then later on, when I went to the bank, Bob Miner was on my board, and one of the men who recommended me to Paul Stillman to become head of the first government banking department in New Jersey.
And politically at that time, at least statewide, I guess the Republicans, up till Governor Miner, were sort of mostly in power during many of those years.
Oh, yeah.
Governor Miner got elected pretty much as a conservative Democrat.
Yes.
And very fiscally conservative.
Talk
about the politics of Governor Miner.
Well, this is a perfect example of why he unfortunately was not liked by state employees. For years, they were talking to Governor Miner to put air conditioning in the State House. He finally did it. Well, before that, they used to leave in a hot summer day, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. They would get out of the State House. After he air conditioned certain offices in the State House, he walked out one day and he saw all these people leaving, and he called his chief of staff, who was probably Brendan Byrne, and said, "What's happening here?" And he says, "Well, that's the tradition." Tradition? No way. And there was an executive order the next day that the people worked from 9 to 5. And that's Bob Miner, and that's how it should be. But they caught up to him when he tried to come back and run after Dick Hughes was governor, or after 8 years of Bob Miner. Dick Hughes became governor for 8 years, and Bob Miner tried to come back. Forget about it. Those state employees, plus a lot of other things. That's how one of the reasons Bill Cahill was elected.
As deputy commissioner, what were the issues in those days affecting the banking and insurance industries?
The number one issue in banking was statewide banking. In those days, banks could not buy banks, could only buy banks within their county. And statewide banking was the number one issue, and I worked very hard for Governor Hughes and Senator, the gentleman from Middlesex, I can't think of his name, white-haired gentleman. But anyway, and but statewide banking was the number one issue when I was deputy commissioner. We worked our heads off, and we lost, but Bill Cahill came in and put the bill through again, and it became, I was then with a bank, First National State, became statewide banking.
And in those days, I guess New Jersey was viewed as one of the more conservative and more protective governments or state governments in the country in terms of banking regulation. And I guess part of that was protecting New Jersey banks against competition from outside, or was this somewhat later?
No, that's later. We were conservative, very much so. You're absolutely right. Plus the fact we had a lot of great insurance companies in New Jersey, and we were very, very proud of Prudential and Mutual Benefit Life especially.
And of course, those insurance companies and some of the banks also were very politically active. John Dryden, for example, at Prudential, became a U.S. Senator from New Jersey. And they were very sort of integral to the government political establishment.
Oh, yeah. In fact, the Prudential, I don't know if it's still true today, but in their charter, whoever the governor is, or a past governor, becomes a member of their board.
That's ended now since they went public.
Oh, thank you. I didn't realize that.
But that's right. It was a very unusual situation where the Chief Justice, I think, of the New Jersey Supreme Court actually used to appoint four directors.
Four or five directors to the board. That's not true today.
No, it's not true today. But
because they're a public company.
To be.
Yeah, okay.
And then it was a tradition that former governors would get appointed to the Prudential Board, which is a very lucrative position.
A very lucrative position, but I always found that the men that were appointed were top-notch. Mm-hmm. They were not cronies, as we think of cronies today.
Mm-hmm. But the banking and insurance industries were sort of very tight with the sort of Trenton insiders, weren't they?
Much so.
And how did that sort of represent it to you in your job as deputy commissioner?
I never felt any pressure whatsoever. In fact, I welcomed the support of the business community. We were very, very active. Charles Howe was, because of his banking insurance, he was the only man in the history of this country became president of the National Banking Commissioners and the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, NAIC. Mm-hmm. Only because he had banking and insurance, but and that was they were both very conservative groups. They still are today.
Can you recall any issues where you sort of knocked heads with either the banking or insurance industries?
No, but knocked heads with certain people when we were trying to get statewide banking. Mm-hmm. I won't mention the name, but he's passed on. He was a very great senator, but he looked me in the eye, and 2 hours later he voted down. He was the lone vote. That's why we lost. Bill Cahill finally convinced him when he became governor. Mm-hmm. But
now, with the election of Governor Cahill, you're sort of looking, I guess, for the next career step.
It was unbelievable. Naturally, I was a Democrat. Bill Cahill was a Republican. And this was in January. Bill Cahill was sworn in January 20th. It was a cold day, outdoors. And about a week before that, I got a call. I'm sitting in my office, and it was from Paul Stillman, who was then chairman of Mutual Benefit Life Insurance Company and chairman of the largest bank, First National State. And my secretary comes running in and says, "Mr. Faherty, Mr. Paul Stillman's on the phone." So he said, "What are you doing Monday?" Which is the following Monday, a week ago. I said, "Nothing." He says, "Come up and see me." So I spent 2 hours with Mr. Stillman, and that's when he offered me the position of vice president in charge of government banking. I said, "Government banking?" He says, "There's no such title in New Jersey. There's only 3 banks in the nation that have a government banking department. And one of my closest friends is chairman of Citibank, and he said, 'Paul, you're missing the boat. No one is looking after governmental funds in the state of New Jersey.' He said, 'There's federal funds, state funds, county, and local, plus all the authorities, the parking authorities, the housing authorities in the various cities. No one is looking after them. No one is giving them interest on their money.' So after that 2 hours, I had 2 hours with Bob Ferguson. And after that, 2 days later, they called me back and offered me a job, which I couldn't refuse. So I started with them, and they put all the officers of the bank, like let's say you were an officer of the bank, you lived in Montclair, and you knew the mayor, and he'd give you a couple accounts, so they'd be in your portfolio, but you have nothing to do with government banking. So they took all that, and it took all those governmental funds away from officers who knew nothing about it, just because they were friends with a local mayor, local treasurer. And it was $10 million in 1970, and 20 years later, I left the bank, and we had over $1 billion worth of governmental funds.
Now, do you think the focus at that time in Stillman and Ferguson's mind was more on the county and local level in terms of business development, or was it state, or all three?
All three. All three. In fact, by the way, I want to make sure what I said. I said I left them with $1 billion. I left them with $1 billion because of men like Bob Cacciola, the former head football coach of Princeton, Billy Raftery, the former basketball coach of Seton Hall, Charlie Mancuso, the former mayor of Hillside, Jerry Greco, the former freeholder director of Essex County. People like that did the work for me. Now you might say, well, they know nothing about. No, they knew nothing about government, nothing about banking, but they knew people and they knew how to meet people. We had all the experts to bring in with them, and that's how we got to all this money.
Now, as a Democrat with a new Republican administration in Trenton,
yes,
was there some concern that you would sort of be frozen out in terms of development of state business?
Very much so. And that's, you scare me because I felt the same way. What am I going to do? But who was I hired by? Mr. Republican of New Jersey at that time, Paul Stillman, one of the largest fundraiser for the Republican Party and one of the largest fundraisers on a national level. So here I am. So when I was asked, the only question that Mr. Ferguson and Mr. Stillman asked me the same in those 4 hours, 2 hours apiece, if we were to give you this job, Bill, could you become an independent? And I looked them right in the eye and I told them the same thing. If I got this job, you're looking at the biggest independent you ever hired. And I have played it right down the middle. I have not been active in any campaign on a local, county, state, and federal level. Since 1970. Do I go to fundraising affairs? Of course, I can go there, but I don't become active. And they respect it. Plus the fact Governor Byrne was the gentleman who changed my whole life as far as tennis is concerned. He established the first governor's tennis tournament in the history of the state of New Jersey. And 33 years later, we've raised over $2 million for the Council on the Arts.
Well, let's sort of not go forward too much right now, but when you went after sort of state government business, did you sort of bring in Mr. Stillman as sort of the chief salesman, or did you feel that everyone knew that he was sort of standing behind as the Republican as you sort of pitched business as a Democrat?
We had a very active bank, and our bank officers knew everyone. My boss, Bruno Mancuso, knew everyone in the city of Newark. So I used the officers who were in the various areas of the state of New Jersey to introduce me to people if I didn't know them myself. I knew a lot of people myself, but I didn't know everyone. So it was a tack that I used, and it worked out fine.
As you sort of developed the government banking business, you have much more contact with the political establishment, not only in Trenton, but sort of throughout the state. Talk a little bit about contacts or your impressions of Governor Cahill at that time.
Governor Cahill was a gentleman, but he was tough. He made a decision, and that was it. I mean, that's how it's going to be. I found him to be fair and honest, and he was a fairly good governor in his day. He had some good people around him, and he worked very hard to make sure that Sports Authority would come about. Very, very hard.
Who were sort of the key people around Governor Cahill?
There's only, well, Joe McCrane, the state treasurer, was his number one person. And the number two person was the Secretary of State, and I'm sorry, I can't think of his name. No, I can't think of his name. Bob Burkhart was, I remember him, but he was not Secretary of State. He was Secretary of State under Bob Minor.
You mentioned that Governor Cahill was sort of very active in developing the Meadowlands and the initial concept.
Oh, yes.
Not only for the sports facilities, but the entire sort of redevelopment of the swamps that had been the Meadowlands, pig farms, and the like.
Governor Cahill was the main person, but the number one driver was Joseph McCrane. He was the man. Cahill got all the credit, but McCrane was the guy in the background. If it wasn't for McCrane, there would be no Meadowlands at that time.
Of course, toward the end of Governor Cahill's first term, he ran into sort of political problems, partly due to sort of controversies and scandals involving some key people around him. And also politically, I guess within the Republican Party, he was sort of, again, the sort of traditional conflict within the GOP in New Jersey between the right and the left wings of the Republican parties, where Governor Cahill was viewed as too liberal or moderate for the dominant Republican power structure. What was sort of your impression of the politics at that time as Governor Cahill prepares to run for a second term?
He was in trouble. The conservatives really wanted to dump him, and they did. I think Charlie Sandman upset him, and I think, I'm not sure of this, but I think Sandman might have been the candidate for governor, but I'm not sure.
Sandman actually ran against Governor Byrne.
Oh, he did. I'm sorry.
The sort of scandals that sort of affected the Cahill administration, was that something that you within the bank sort of had any sort of an attitude toward, or
the only thing I knew about the scandals that he had were through the newspapers, especially the Star Ledger. I never knew of anything that that was given to me second-handed by a state senator or a senator.
Getting back, Congressman Sandman did defeat Governor Cahill in the primary, and then ran against Governor Byrne in the general election.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
Right.
That when I said the conservatives really, because Sandman was a conservative from South Jersey, and of course Cahill was from South Jersey too, Collingswood. But Sandman, I mean, he came out of nowhere, and whammo, he gave it to Cahill.
And were you, as sort of a prominent business figure at that time, sort of shocked by the result in the Republican primary?
Yes, positively. I never thought Cahill would be defeated. And Bill Cahill was a likable person, but he was tough. When he made a decision, you couldn't change that decision, right or wrong.
Of course, at this time, Brendan Byrne is a sitting judge. He's looking, I guess, at the political scene. People are urging him to sort of resign as a judge and get into the race. What were your sort of first impressions, and in going back, did you meet Governor Byrne in earlier years, like when he was with Governor Minor, or when was your sort of first meeting with Governor Byrne?
My first meeting, and probably just a few meetings, when he was with the outer office of Governor Minor. And that's when I met Brendan Byrne. But I really didn't follow Brendan's career after that. He became a Superior Court judge, prosecutor also of Essex County, and then I think he became a Superior Court judge. And then I lost track of him until all of a sudden his name started appearing in the papers, that he's a possible candidate for governor.
So your first sort of meetings with him when he was Governor Minor's executive secretary and assistant counsel before that were sort of very cursory, not anything significant at that point.
No, but I still remember him as a very, very good person to talk with. I mean, I did have a few conversations with him, but not that much. But he was intelligent.
Was he viewed at that time as sort of a political cover?
No. Not in my estimation. Not in my estimation, no.
Okay. All right, but getting back, I guess, to the primary, when Congressman Sandman defeats Governor Cale, Governor Byrne does resign as a judge and enters the Democratic primary. How did you sort of assess the Democratic field at that time? It was a fairly crowded field.
And I don't remember that.
Well, you had Ann Klein running, I think.
Yeah, she was from the Department of...
the later Department of Human Services.
Thank you.
And you had you had some talk, I guess, at that time of Congressman Helstosky entering the race. He did not enter the race, but he was viewed as a potential...
Yeah, Henry Helstosky was viewed as a very strong candidate because he was in Bergen County.
And we have other candidates in the race. We have an Essex County favorite son. Did you sort of follow which counties were sort of backing which horses?
Not really.
Point?
Was Ralph DeRose in there?
Yes, he was.
Yeah, Essex County?
So,
yeah, he was, yeah.
Now, part of the reason that I believe Governor Byrne has said he resigned as a judge to get in the race is that he was sort of viewed as the candidate who fit the time. Governor Cale's administration had been beset by some scandals. Nationally, I guess you were sort of getting in the sort of Watergate era in the Nixon administration.
Sure.
So Governor Byrne is a former prosecutor who also became known through the mafia wiretaps as the man who couldn't be bought.
Yeah.
And then later,
very important.
And then later, a judge sort of fit, I guess, the politician's idea of if you needed a candidate with this type of resume, this is the type of person, because he looks so squeaky clean.
Yeah, Mr. Clean. And he was.
So did you feel
he
that...
He couldn't be bought.
Did you feel that when he got in the race that he was the odds-on favorite?
The strongest candidate, I felt.
Okay. What do you remember about that sort of campaign?
I really don't remember too much. All I remember is I went to a couple debates, and it was between Mr. Sandman and Governor Byrne, and there was no contest. League of Women Voters, for example.
Well, what were we like? We've had some other people say that Governor Byrne in those days was not a real skilled public speaker.
No, but yeah, I understand your thinking on that, and some of the people might say that. But in those, I went to one or two debates. I remember the League of Women Voters, and I thought he won that debate hands down. And I think he answered every question in a very, very forthright way.
And at that time, and continues to that day, to this day, taxes were sort of an issue in that campaign. Did the bank and the sort of business community in general have sort of a cohesive position on tax policy in New Jersey?
Not really. Maybe the New Jersey bankers had, but I wasn't active in that organization.
Okay. Because a few years before, the sales tax had been passed as the sort of first statewide tax.
Right.
New Jersey still was one of the few states without a statewide income tax, and as the campaign between Byrne and Sandman develops. And of course, Governor Byrne during that campaign sort of made the remark that he didn't see the need for an income tax in the foreseeable future, which sort of came to haunt him a little bit later as he did push the income tax through. But I guess it was your feeling that he was going to easily win that general election?
No doubt in my mind. And I think the polls showed it too.
Now, was there some concern among Mr. Stillman or the other sort of Republican business sort of leaders that this Democratic administration would be too liberal for the business community?
Not really. Not really. They knew Brendan Byrne a little bit because he was from Essex County. Our bank was Essex County. And well, I'm sure maybe, I don't know who they voted for. If they're Republicans, they voted for the Republican. But they didn't express any, they didn't come out and endorse Mr. Sandman.
Do you remember any of the prominent Democratic business leaders who sort of supported Governor Burns'
No, I really don't. There probably were many.
Okay.
Probably guys like Tom Stanton, the late Tom Stanton. But I can't say.
In any event, Governor Byrne is elected.
Yep.
Shortly after the election and before his inauguration, the issue comes up about the sort of Meadowlands proposal that had been advanced by Governor Cahill, and specifically the financing of Giant Stadium at that point, given that New York had made a very aggressive effort to keep the football Giants in New York. So what was the bank's role, and what do you remember about that time?
I remember being over in New York at the final. We thought the bonds were going to be sold that day, and $50 million was pulled out by, unfortunately, Governor Rockefeller by calling his brother, and who was then head of Chase Bank, and $50 million disappeared.
David Rockefeller.
David Rockefeller. And by the way, who was a great banker and a very fine gentleman. But he pulled $50 million out of that bond issue. But I remember Bob Ferguson asking or telling myself and Alex Williams, who headed our bond department, was part of the team to put this thing together. Anything ever happened, never thinking 50 million, but anything ever happened to that bond, give me a call before you close it or to do away with it. So we asked for an hour so we could call our chairman, our president, Bob Ferguson. And he said, give me 2 days. We went back right from New York, right back to his office around 5:30 in the evening. And he had already made calls to Bob Beck from Prudential, Bob Van Fossen, Mutual Benefit, Bob Van Buren, Mid-Atlantic. And the next morning at 10 o'clock, the $50 million was there. Prudential put in the biggest 25 million, and then the other banks put in 10, 10, 5.
And how active was Brendan Byrne during this period?
Very, very active. I mean, it was something that he felt had to be done.
And I believe he worked fairly closely with Governor Cahill during this transition period, particularly on this issue.
Yes.
But they developed a fairly sort of close relationship in trying to work together.
Oh, I thought that the bond, the Meadowlands agreement brought both Governor Byrne and Governor Cahill very, very close. I think they remained close up until the death of Governor Cahill. Mm-hmm. And I think they respected each other too.
Mm-hmm. And so what was the sort of reaction in the New Jersey sort of banking and business community toward this end run in New York? Was it also some fear that maybe the New York business establishment might sort of take it out against you from a business perspective, given this confrontation?
Oh, no. In fact, we even started an ad campaign. If our bank, First National State Bank, we had a big ad campaign. No more rivers to cross. That means you didn't have to go to New York to get the money. We have the money right here in New Jersey. Now, and there was no backfire, no backlash at all.
Okay. But there wasn't clout from the major Manhattan banks that they could have exercised against you from a business perspective?
No, they didn't do it. The deal, after the $50 million was put back in, the deal was finished. That was going to be it.
Okay. What other,
no one else withdrew money.
Okay. What other memories? Did you have any direct contact with the Mara family at that point?
At that point, no.
Okay.
I did not personally.
And who were the other personalities? I guess Dick DeCourt was pretty active.
very, very active. And there was a big bonded gentleman from New York, and I can't think of his name. He's passed on, but he was so active in making sure this would go through. Can't think of his name. I'm sorry.
In any event, Governor Byrne then takes office and is inaugurated. He soon has to deal with the income tax as sort of the major issue in his first term in office, largely provoked by the New Jersey Supreme Court's decision in Robinson v. Cahill, finding that the existing state financing formula for funding public schools was unconstitutional under the state constitution.
Exactly.
Again, was there sort of any reaction in the business community of this crisis, or was it viewed as something that really the politicians in Trenton and the legislature would handle?
There was some doubts about that, but they had confidence in the governor.
Of course, they had confidence, but the early sort of years of his first term were sort of beset with falling popularity, people claiming that he had misled them during the campaign by saying he didn't see the need for an income tax, and it was somewhat of a bleak period for the Byrne administration.
It was, and he did go through a year and a half of a lot of people saying OTB. And OTB, one-term Byrne. Guess what? Didn't work. But I'll tell you right now, a lot of people, a lot of my friends, and a lot of his friends, I mean, even though they loved him, but they thought he was a one-term burner.
He also got some criticism for being somewhat aloof and distant and compared to Governor Hughes and possibly even Governor Cahill, not the sort of glad-handing type of politician that some people had gotten used to in Trenton.
Right. Well, Dick Hughes was one of a kind. There'll never be another governor, I don't think, like Dick Hughes. But he was not a Dick Hughes. But as far as his brain power is concerned, he was a Dick Hughes. He was Brendan Byrne was a very, very smart person, and he had good people around him. That was the key.
We'll talk a little bit about those good people. His sort of key campaign person and first state treasurer was Richard Leone,
who is still active today, who's helping our new governor, John Corzine. Dick Leone is a master as far as I'm concerned as state treasurer. He's one of he could go down as probably the finest state treasurer we ever had. And although there have been some great state treasurers, Michael Horn, Joe McCrane, but Dick Leone, his attorney general, was an excellent man. William Highland. Thank you, my apologies. Bill Highland, I mean, just great background. He brought in good people. All his cabinet, I can't name them all, but if I had all their names, I could go through every one of them and show you they were just qualified people, highly respected. And, you know, when it comes down to the final say, when you go in that voting booth, you look at everything that the governor has done, he did some very, very fine things. His appointments were masterful.
But he did have some rocky sort of relations with the legislature, and some felt that there was an arrogance and somewhat of a lack of communication in those first years. Did you get that feel in your sort of days in sort of dealing with people who, you know, were close in the administration and talking to legislators at the time?
Well, I think every governor goes through that. I think our present governor, John Corzine, is going through this right now. I mean, it's just that the legislature and the governor sometimes just don't see eye to eye, and there were many times during Brendan's first year and a half they didn't see eye to eye.
Do you recall any sort of active lobbying effort by the Byrne people to sort of get prominent business people to back a tax package that included an income tax?
No, I don't know. I can't answer that question.
Okay. As we get sort of past the tax issue, another issue that became very significant was the sort of the future of Atlantic City. Let's talk a little bit about sort of your memories about that. When was the first time you went to Atlantic City? Was it as a child?
Yes, my father was very active in the New Jersey real estate, New Jersey realtors, and also the New Jersey savings loan, before that the building loan, but savings loan. And we used to go down to the Chalfont Haddon Hall, and he loved that Wedgwood room. That was the big dining room, which was famous. And we stayed at the Berkeley, Chalfont Haddon Hall was his keeper. He loved that Chalfont Haddon Hall. And that later became, believe it or not, in my day, Resorts International.
And what were your memories of the boardwalk and the sort of entertainment, the diving horse? Do you remember all that?
Oh, the diving horse. I can't. In fact, I became very friendly with the gentleman who owned the diving horse, George Hammett, and George Hammett Jr.
We went to the State Fair for many years.
Oh, they were, when I was deputy mayor, they owned the New Jersey State Fair. Great story that a lot of people don't know. George Hammett Sr., his first night in America, you know where he slept? He got off the boat in New York, and he came to Trenton. He slept in a stable on the New Jersey State Fairgrounds. 22 years later, he owned the New Jersey State Fairgrounds, plus the Atlantic City Steel Pier. He won a Horatio Alger Award.
So your early memories of Atlantic City were pretty positive.
Oh, it was a great city. It was a fantastic city. Unfortunately, during the war, and all the hotels became almost like hospitals. All the wounded veterans came back and were stationed, and most of the hotels became hospitals. And then Atlantic City started to go down. I was president of the New Jersey Junior Chamber of Commerce, the JCs. I was elected president in Atlantic City. But in those days, Atlantic City was really drab. There was nothing.
And in 1964, the Democratic National Convention was held in Atlantic City.
Yeah.
Did you go?
No, I did not.
But that's sort of viewed by some people as sort of the depths of Atlantic City before a national audience, that all the hotels were deteriorated.
I can remember reading in the New York Times, in the Star Ledger, the Trenton Times, the Trentonian, how down they were, the reporters on Atlantic City. It was the bottom pit of the world. It was terrible.
Well, in any event, as Governor Burns sort of takes office, there are sort of proposals for different ways to revive Atlantic City, and obviously the most prominent was to authorize casino gambling. And the initial ideas, I guess, were even broader than Atlantic City. The casinos would be authorized along the shore.
Oh, plus, I'm sorry to interrupt, what's his name, Hugh Hefner, even though he bought a hotel in Atlantic City, but before that he bought the place up in New Vernon. He figured that the Playboy Club, which he built up there, only 50 miles from New York, would become a gaming facility. And if it did, Hugh Hefner would be worth $1 billion today. But Atlantic City, Steve Persky wrote the law, and everyone followed him, that it was only Atlantic City. And I feel that way. It passed. The voting, first time they voted, it was defeated,
Right.
And the second time, the people really went to work, and they passed it.
Now, did the bank take an active interest in the redevelopment of Atlantic City?
Oh, very much so. We never took an active interest in the in the voting of the. But once Atlantic City once New Jersey decided that Atlantic City were going to have gaming, our bank decided that we would look into Resorts International. And what happened? A young man by the name of Ed Mirror, who was very active in Trenton area and a very close personal friend of Brendan Byrne, in fact, his tennis partner many times, called me one day and said, "Bill, I want to have you meet 3 gentlemen at dinner in Trenton, New Jersey, at Pete Lorenzo's restaurant across from the train station." And I met James Crosby, who I didn't know any of these men, Jack Davis, and Steve Norton. Crosby was chairman, Davis was president, and Norton was executive vice president of Resorts International in the Bahamas. And they wanted to buy the shelf on Haddon Hall and turn it into Resorts International. In 3 hours, I heard a presentation. It was fantastic. I said, my God, Faherty, this is going to be the salvation of Atlantic City. This is going to bring back Atlantic City. I could see it if we could get them approved and if our bank would approve it. At that time, they told me, they looked me right in the eye, Bill, there's not one bank insurance company in America or the world will give us $10 million. That's all we need, 10. Well, we gave them 12. And it took 9 months of investigation, strict investigation. We had each of the gentlemen sign an affidavit that if they couldn't get licensed, they had to get out of their business. All three were licensed, and Resorts International became, because First National State Bank gave them $12 million.
And of course, Governor Burns' Attorney General at that time, John Degnan, who succeeded Bill Highland,
That's right.
opposed the licensing, I believe.
And I really don't know why. He had his reasons, I guess. I don't know why. I never ran into that situation with John Degnan.
Who were the other key players? I think before you mentioned Joel Stearns. As
Joel
very
Stearns.
significant
He was the chief negotiator in New Jersey. He was the attorney for Jim Crosby. And by the way, after we're doing this, and I got really involved in this, took us 9 months to give them the $12 million. I found out that Jim Crosby's sister is Elaine Murphy. Elaine Murphy is the one of my closest personal friend, Henry Murphy, the funeral director in Trenton, New Jersey. He married Elaine Crosby from Spring Lake, New Jersey. I didn't know this all before I met Mr. Crosby. I found out later. And Henry used to say to me, "What are you doing, my brother-in-law?" I said, "Giving him $12 million, I hope." Well, you know what happened. It was unbelievable. People in Atlantic City who owned these little jitneys, they sold the jitneys and cashed in Mary Carter Paints. That was the original stock. That the Mary Carter Paints, 50 cents a share, went up to 100 and split. These men, some of them made a couple hundred, $400,000. They thought Jim Crosby was the Lord himself.
As Atlantic City developed, did the bank get involved in other casino financings?
Yeah, I had a tough job. Mr. Ferguson, Mr. Stillman called me in after it was all over and said, "Bill, we want you and your wife to take 6 months of your time." I had to give my government banking department over to Pete Clancy. "We want you to travel the United States and meet every major casino owner in America." And in that time, it was unheard of. Knocking on the door of Caesar's World, which owned Caesar's Palace, which was thinking of buying the Holiday Inn the Howard Johnson, Atlantic City. Knocking on the door of Bill McElney and Terry Lanny, who was then the head of Caesar's World. They couldn't believe a banker would knock on their door. They never had any insurance person or banker. Of the first 11 casinos, we did 6 of them. So we did all right.
And how was that sort of travel? Did you find it that you were getting to be an expert on the casino business?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the casino, but I'm an expert in bringing in the key players to meet our key players at the bank. That was my job, is to make sure that I got to know the presidents of the companies, the executive vice presidents, the chief financial officer, which was the key. And I did. Terry Lanny, for example, is now J. Terrence Lanny, is now chairman and CEO of MGM Mirage, which owns the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, owned by Kirk Kerkorian.
Yeah. And of course, in those days, the casino companies were trying to sort of get away from the earlier image of the industry developed in the first days of Las Vegas, of sort of mafia and organized crime.
And yes, and the Teamsters. I mean, Teamsters are the biggest supporters of Las Vegas. I mean, if it wasn't for the Teamsters, there'd be no Las Vegas in the beginning. this is when Brendan Byrne said to us, to Bob Ferguson, Paul Stillman, and Bill Faherty, and our team, I want legitimate money to go into Resorts International. And I know if you can do it, it'll be legitimate. I don't want any, if there's any bad money going in, they're not going to get licensed. Well, he was very, very happy and satisfied when I called him and told him that we were going to do the deal 9 months later.
And of course, he made that, I guess, famous speech on the boardwalk where he said, "Keep your dirty hands out of Atlantic City."
He told the boys in the back room to keep your dirty hands out of Atlantic City.
Now, in retrospect, New Jersey, particularly because of Brendan Byrne's sort of feeling that he was going to allow casinos, but in a very highly regulated environment in New Jersey, in which organized crime would hopefully be excluded. But in retrospect, were the strict regulations somewhat counterproductive in the city's development? Did it sort of hamper, I guess, the industry in recruiting executives to move from Las Vegas or other casino jurisdictions around the world to New Jersey because they were so investigated, so regulated, so sort of looked over?
Excellent question. In the beginning, you're absolutely right. A lot of the men and some women from Las Vegas wanted no part of Atlantic City. They thought it was going to be, the pits. But in later years, it turned out to be all right. I mean, when Caesars decided to buy the Howard Johnsons and turn it into Caesars, New Jersey, and when Bally, the big equipment from Chicago, Bill O'Donnell, decided to come to New Jersey and buy the hotel down there, that changed the whole aspect. Caesars and Bally were the two biggest. And then when Bill Harrah came in and started Harrah's, I mean, it was unbelievable. So, yes, in the beginning there was a lot of questions by a lot of experts who were in the casino gaming business. They wanted no part of Atlantic City, even though they were with some major companies.
And what's your view about some of the other sort of policy decisions that were made at the time, given the luxury of looking back over these many years? For example, one of the things that New Jersey did was sort of require that every hotel develop internally restaurants, shops, other things within the hotels. I guess because the feeling was we weren't going to allow these casino companies simply to come in and build a casino and rake the money from gambling and not do other things to make Atlantic City into a diverse resort. But some people, I guess, have criticized that decision by saying by bringing everything into the hotel, we stifled the sort of development outside the hotels, the stores, the smaller merchants, the restaurants that might have developed if that decision hadn't been written into law. What's your own view on that?
It's an excellent question. And if I was a merchant in Atlantic City, I would not like what the law says. But I look at it a different way. I look at the big picture. And the big picture is that I think it's fantastic what's happening in the hotels today. Look at Tropicana, what they just did. Unbelievable. The Borgata. Unbelievable. Mr. Boyd Bill Boyd is to be congratulated on what he did over there. It's just, it had to be. They had to have those stores. They had to have those shops. They had to have those restaurants. In fact, I say today, we probably couldn't build a restaurant for $10 million in the Borgata. Mm-hmm. And that's what, $12 million to open resorts. I mean, it was a pittance in those days. Mm-hmm. But if it wasn't there, there'd be no Atlantic City at that time.
Mm-hmm. And I assume that the Meadowlands and Atlantic City were the largest issues that the bank had sort of special business interests in that dealt with the time of the Byrne administration.
Yeah. And I give full credit to two men, Bob Ferguson and Paul Stillman. Mm-hmm. They were the leaders. If it wasn't for Bob Ferguson, that Meadowlands would be way, way, way put off. He saved the Meadowlands by those phone calls that he made. And Mr. Stillman, really pushed heavily, and Bob did too, in getting that $12 million for gaming in Atlantic City. Of course, I must tell you that after Resorts opened, we bought the biggest bank in Atlantic City, Elwood Kirkman's bank, First National Bank of South Jersey.
Now, as Governor Burns sort of starts thinking about running for re-election, and there were several people urging him not to run for re-election because his numbers in the polls were so low, what was your own view?
I never doubted that he could. I always felt he could make it. Of course, I was maybe too close to the situation. I really liked Brendan Byrne. I like people, you know, I go back to Arthur Holland, and Brendan Byrne reminded me of Arthur Holland. Mm-hmm. No bull, honesty, and I like that. And I thought, although I'm going to tell you right now, there's a couple of people in our bank, and not the people I mentioned, but other high-ranking banking officials, not only in our bank, but some other banks, told me at the Essex Club one day at lunch, no way, Ray Bateman's the next governor. And I looked them right in the eye, all five of them around the table, and I said, oh, they kept saying OTB, OTB. I said, guess what? OTB is going to be Governor Burns' second term. You're crazy, Faherty. Mm-hmm. I couldn't wait to get to him the next time after governor was elected. But a lot of people felt that he was going down the drain.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any sort of backroom conversations with any of the Democratic political people then as to how the governor might fare first in the primary? He had several challengers to his primary, including one of his own cabinet people.
No. To answer that question, I had no particular insight on that.
And given the fact that he had Joe Hoffman, who had developed some strong relationships within the business and labor community at the time.
Yeah, he was with Bell Telephone.
Right. But did that sort of split the business community? Did you feel that there were people who were sort of hoping that Hoffman would defeat Governor Byrne?
I like Joe Hoffman, but a lot of people felt he was kind of a traitor. Mm-hmm. I don't like to use that word. And he couldn't pull it off. Although he was a good man, I agree with you. And some of the business people did, but he couldn't pull it off. I always felt that personally.
Okay. And what do you remember about the sort of general election between Ray Bateman and Brendan Byrne?
Well, I can tell you right now, I just told you, most of the people felt that Ray Bateman was the next governor. But they say that some of his advisors kind of did him in. I don't know how they did him in, but Bill Simon, and he took some kind of report, I don't remember what it was.
The Bateman-Simon plan, the BS plan for how to avoid the income tax.
Right, exactly. And it just didn't go over. But I can tell you, right up to the time, I would say half of my friends, both personally and in the business community, felt that Bateman was the next governor. Mm-hmm. And by the way, if Ray Bateman had ever become governor after Brendan Burns for 8 years, he had made a great governor. Mm-hmm. Ray Bateman would have made a great governor.
Did you attend any of the debates?
Oh, yes.
And how did they
They were good.
Off?
They were excellent. They were excellent. They were close debates. Mm-hmm. They were good debates.
Mm-hmm. Well, Governor Byrne does get reelected, surprising all the sort of critics.
I forget the percentage of voting at that time.
It was something like 58%. It was a fairly substantial.
58% is very good.
Surprising margin. And in the second term, I guess it was a much sort of easier path. Governor Byrne had sort of restored his political credentials through the election, and he had a fairly active agenda, probably a lot of things that weren't terribly significant to the bank's interest, like the Pinelands and other sort of efforts to reform government and make open government. and to create New Jersey Transit. Were there other things that you recall in the second term that either you sort of were interested in, either as a citizen or as a banker?
Not really. Not really.
Did the Pinelands and sort of the idea that so much of New Jersey would be foreclosed to development have some negative connotation in terms of the sort of chilling of investment?
I think the bank in South Jersey that we bought didn't like the idea of that Pinelands development. But I don't think we ever fought it, came out strongly against it. But I'm sure that Mr. Kirkman, the late Elwood Kirkman, and people like that, strong leaders in Atlantic County, were not for that development.
What are your memories of some of the key sort of legislative people at the time? So let's start from Trenton, Joe Merlino.
Joe Merlino was a very good, solid state senator. He was an attorney. He married a wonderful lady, Molly Merlino, had a great family, and tough as nails, and helped defeat Arthur Holland because he was almost like a guiding light for Carmen Armenti.
What about Alan Karcher?
A gentleman who was, I think, a very deep thinker. He was strong, sturdy, and a good assembly speaker. And he kept his word. That was one of the great things. He kept his word. His word was his bond, and I think his daughter's going to make a great person too.
How about Al Burstein?
Honest, strong, and willing to listen as an assemblyman, and always available. Had that open door policy. Wonderful man.
Bill Hamilton?
One of the great legislators, I think, of our time.
What about Howard Woodson?
S. Howard Woodson, Shiloh Baptist Church, one of the great preachers in New Jersey's history in the church. His wife, lovely wife, beautiful wife, Audrey. The first black city commissioner in the history of the city of Trenton. Ran on Arthur Holland's ticket. Wonderful man, wonderful gentleman. And the first black speaker of the New Jersey Assembly. I would come back after a summer's vacation, 2 weeks at the shore, and come back with a full tan. And he always criticized Arthur Holland, not enough blacks in high places. And I would come in the room, he says, finally we got a black in a high place with Faherty back here. True story. Howard was a wonderful person. Miss him very, very much.
How about Chris Jackman?
Mr. Hudson County. Jovial, down to earth, and always kept his word.
How about Joe LaFonte?
One of my favorites from Hudson County. A man you could always depend on if a tough fight was in the General Assembly and he was on your side, man, he'd make sure he got the votes for you. Just a wonderful person.
Who were some of the other sort of people that you had a lot of contact with?
Oh, Warren Willens.
Robert.
I'm sorry, Warren, and please forgive me, Warren, and I hope you're feeling better. Robert Willens, who I would have taken time off to my job. I would have taken a year's off. He knows this too, I told Bob this. As Governor Richard J. Hughes became the first Catholic governor of the state of New Jersey, I believe that Robert Willens would have become the first Jewish governor of the state of New Jersey. And I told him this to his face at a private luncheon, the two of us, trying to urge him to run for governor. And I would take a year of my time, not that I'm going to elect him governor, but I would put everything in it to make sure that that he'd be governor and get the right people behind him.
Do you remember about when that was?
No, I don't. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Post Brendan Byrne, or
I
No.
forget.
any other sort of figures that sort of stick out in your mind as sort of colorful, or about Billy Musto?
I didn't know the mayor very well from, I think, Union City. He was one of the early proponents of gaming in New Jersey. A lot of people don't know that, but it went nowhere in those days. I really didn't know Senator Musto and Mayor Musto.
You mentioned him previously, but how about Steve Persky?
Oh, brilliant. I mean, another man who probably could have made a run for governor. But, he was in a situation, let's say he was from a county that was really a big Republican county. But very good head on the shoulders. Brilliant.
Bill, I guess toward the latter years of the Byrne administration, maybe more into the Kane administration, the banking industry is sort of changing significantly nationally and in New Jersey. Sort of as a New Jersey banker, how did you sort of see that?
Well, you mean the banks were being bought by other banks? Yeah, well, they called it progress, and the only way that we could make major loans is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and we could have more programs for the average bank, of average depositor, and so forth. It's here. We have now nationwide banking, and it's working. But when it goes back to the old days, there's nothing like that little community home state bank.
And during the Byrne administration, the sort of first start of the tennis tournament that you have chaired for over 30 years now.
33 years this year.
Got started. Let's sort of talk a little bit about how it got started and what your role was.
Well, Brendan Byrne was very, very close to the Kennedy family, and especially Robert F. Kennedy, the late United States Senator from New York, who had a tragic death, and I thought would become the next President of the United States, but that's another story. When he was killed, Mrs. Kennedy decided that she would have a memorial for him and call it the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Tennis Tournament. And Brendan played in the New York tournament. And she said to him, "Why don't you start a New Jersey tournament?" Well, through Ed Mirror and Bill Faherty, or Mirror probably said, "Why don't you get Bill Faherty to be the chairman of it?" We only had 5 teams in those days. The 5 Bobs that I mentioned before. The Newark, they were the first 5 teams. And we did that for about 4 or 5 years. And the last year we topped. There was 11 states, and we topped every state. We got $100,000 at last. But then Mrs. Kennedy decided to give it up. And the night that Governor Kane was sworn in, they had a little party at Drumthrocket, and the Governor Byrne took me over to. I think they were in cahoots. Took me over to Governor Kane and said that Mrs. Kennedy's not going to have the tournament anymore. And Governor Kane said, "Oh, would you run a tournament for my favorite charity, which was the New Jersey Council on the Arts?" So I've been doing that, and we've raised over $2 million in the past years under Kane, Governor Florio, Governor Whitman, Governor DeFrancesco, Governor Cody. I hope I got all the governors in. And now Governor John Corzine. And on July 6th of this year, Governor Corzine is brushing up on his tennis, and he will have a partner and will play in a governor's tennis tournament. Governor Kane plays every year. Governor Byrne used to play every year, but Brendan's legs are like my legs. They're getting a little older, and not as spry as he used to be. But Governor Byrne was a great tennis player.
And just to give some context, the Governor's Tennis Tournament attracts many corporate-sponsored teams from all over the state.
The reason we raised the money is because of the corporate teams. I mean, it's just unbelievable. It's a corporate tournament, doubles. They play doubles at Princeton University. And they're the finest courts in the world, in the country. And then we have a luncheon at Drumthwacket under a tent, and then we have the finals right at Drumthwacket.
Now, one other sort of quasi-business, quasi-social activity that you were fairly prominent in the Byrne administration were the sort of foreign trips that the governor would take. Let's reminisce a little bit about those.
They were fantastic. Governor Byrne decided that he would have trade missions to Europe. And he selected Bob Ferguson one year to be the chairman of the first trade mission. And I guess you had to be a CEO of a company to go. Rocco Morano, president of New Jersey Bell, and the 5 Bobs were all there. Prudential, Public Service, and First National State, Mid-Atlantic, Mutual Benefit, Merck, you name it, all the CEOs. I think we had about first trip, we had 15 CEOs. And the reason I got involved, I was kind of like the executive director of the trip. But the people who really made that trip successful was the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, because they had all the contacts. We went to England, Germany, France, and Italy, and Japan. Oh, I'm sorry, Japan, my apologies. And it was just unbelievable. And people say, well, what happened? We did bring some business back to New Jersey. In fact, a heck of a lot of business.
Of course, a lot of press and sort of political opponents criticized these trips as junkets. What was your sort of own view?
Well, they did in a way, but they decided to send a reporter from the Newark Evening News, and he straightened that whole thing out. I mean, he was with us, and he saw the men working their heads off every day. We had appointments with the top companies that we wanted to meet in these countries. And in fact, he had a little blurb about Bill Faherty in England. We happened to have we had an off couple hours, and we had a tour of the great cathedral in England, Westminster Abbey. And we all went in there, and there's so much. I love history, any type of history, but there's so much history where the kings and queens of England were crowned. And I wanted to go in a spot you couldn't get there. So I saw where I could go around the back. So I started to go through the back, and a tap on the shoulder. And I said, Father, I'm sorry. He says, well, how can I help you, my son? I said, I'm from New Jersey, and I'm with a trade mission with our governor, Governor Byrne. And they have it all roped off. I just wanted to kneel where the kings and queens of England were crowned. He says, follow me, my son. So we went out. Well, the delegation almost fell over when Faherty comes out with this priest. And we genuflect, and I kneel, and we said some prayers, and afterwards he let me go out through the rope-off area. And I said, Father, what is your name? He says, I'm the Archbishop of Canterbury. And that got a great play in the Star Ledger. True story.
And of course, despite, I guess, the public perception of these trips, Governor Byrne wasn't quite the sort of late-night owl on these junkets, was he?
No. Governor Byrne would always be the first to go to bed. And when we were in England, we had they had I forget the name of there was a famous club over there, and so I took all the gentlemen to this club one night for dinner, and the governor had dinner, but they had gaming also at this club, so we had a great time that evening.
So the partying started after Governor
Governor went back to bed. Yeah, the troopers took him back, and he was in bed. Okay. But he was very serious, and And the men that were on that trip were very serious. I mean, they did a lot of work. There was, but I think after the Star-Ledger reporter went with the trip, it straightened that out. It was not a junket. By the way, it was paid for by the individual companies.
Now, Governor Byrne leaves office in January 1982 and is succeeded by Governor Kane.
Yes.
First of all, any sort of comments you want to make about Governor Byrne before we move on to the Governor Kane and the rest of the New Jersey governors you've known?
Yeah. In my estimation, Brendan Byrne, when history is written, will go down as one of the top 5 governors we've had in New Jersey in my lifetime. He is no doubt a man had a lot of vision, and as I said in the beginning, he was honest and genuine. And he was a man of his word. His word was his bond. So I think he will go down as one of the great governors of our state.
Now, he's succeeded by Tom Kean.
Yes.
When did you first meet Tom Kean?
When he was Speaker of the New Jersey Assembly, just routinely in different areas of business, I met him. Naturally, he was very friendly. The Kean family and his father, Congressman Kean, and Paul Stillman, the man who hired me at First National State, Mr. Republican, I used to call him, of New Jersey, were like that. They were very close.
And of course, the Kean family also had banking interests.
Yeah, they were competitors. They were great competitors. Our National State Bank of Elizabeth was the Kean Bank. It was a very great bank.
What other sort of memories do you have of the Kean administration and your role?
Well, I became very close personally over the years with a wonderful man, although he was tough as nails. A lot of people didn't like him in the administration. And that was Greg Stevens, who was his chief of staff, who I felt turned his whole administration around. He was floundering maybe the first couple of years. But Greg came in and really did a job, and we have become lifelong friends since then.
And of course, at least after a few early struggles, Governor Kean becomes one of the more popular governors in New Jersey, particularly because the economy had started to boom in the 1980s as it had nationally.
That was just what I was going to say. The economy really went up, and his popularity went up. Plus the fact that he's a very popular man anyway. I mean, he has a way about him that is very nice. New Jersey and you perfect together.
Now, one of the major accomplishments of the Kean administration was, as you had pointed out earlier, his interest in arts and the development of the Performing Arts Center in Newark. Was that something the bank had any interest in, or was it somewhat of a small project in terms of the finance?
No, the bank, I give full credit to Roy Vagelos, the chairman of Merck, but our bank was very active in establishing that center, and we gave heavily toward the bank, toward the center, Prudential being number one. But no, the bank was very positive. A lot of people didn't think that center, the PAC, would work. The Performing Arts Center would be valuable in Newark. They felt people wouldn't go. Guess what? It's one of the best art centers in the world. And Larry Goldman, to his credit, is just a tremendous director.
Now, the bank's headquarters was in Newark. Newark had its troubles, particularly with the riots and the sort of urban decline that affected many of New Jersey's cities. What was sort of the bank's attitude about sort of staying in Newark, recruiting people to work in Newark? It must have been very difficult in those days.
Our bank stayed in Newark along with all the great banks in Newark and the great insurance companies. We were not going to move out of Newark, and we didn't move until a few years ago. They established the headquarters in Summit, New Jersey. But after the riots, no way were we. In fact, we put on one of the greatest ad campaigns New Jersey has ever seen. We ran a series of 12 ads in every major newspaper. I'm sorry.
Bill, Governor Kane's administration, as the economy is booming, I assume the banking business is booming, but you're also having these pressures on deregulation and consolidation and mergers. Was that sort of an upsetting time as sort of the banking industry becomes much less secure and stable than it sort of historically has
I think
been?
a lot of the major, the senior employees of the bank were upset a little bit because they were losing, control of their little areas of employment. But, as time went on, they felt that they didn't lose their jobs. They were still there, and they were making good money. And times were good, so there was no really great pressure.
And at some point you leave the banking business, which has been your career for many years at that point.
Yeah.
What was sort of your consideration then as to carving out a new path?
Again, one of my mentors, Bob Ferguson, who was then past chairman of the New Jersey State Chamber of Commerce, came to me one day and said, "I got a proposition, let's go to lunch." So we went to Essex Club, and he told me, he said, they're looking for, and he says, "I think you'd be perfect with your background, president of the New Jersey State Chamber of Commerce. And you've been active in the State Chamber, not on the board, but running the parties at the annual congressional delegation. I've been doing that. I must have done that for 20 years. And after the dinner, entertaining our clients and would-be clients at the hotel in Washington. And he said, there's a position open. Fred Westfall, who was there for about 20 years, is retiring. He was a former head of Exxon in New Jersey. And they're looking for someone to succeed him. And there were a number of 5 or 6 candidates, but they would like to interview you. I said, yeah, but that's all right. He says, I think you should do it. I mean, you should be interviewed. So he wasn't on the committee, but there were 5 or 6 men on the committee. I think Tom Stanton from First Jersey, who was a great competitor of ours from Jersey City, was the chairman of the selection committee. And I was interviewed, and in fact I had 2 interviews. And all of a sudden I got called down to Trenton, and they made me an offer. So I decided that I would change my life from banking to business, which is to the New Jersey State Chamber of Commerce, and I was president for 5 years, succeeded by a great person, Joe Verplank, who was then, at that time, the chamber president of Morris County.
Of course, at that time also, like in the banking industry, the sort of New Jersey business establishment is evolving. Many of the sort of traditional companies, mutual benefit, others, AT&T was starting its sort of long road to decline.
And the Bells, the Baby Bells.
And the Baby Bells.
Famous Judge Green and his...
divestiture order.
That's right.
So you sort of have this attrition among the traditional establishment of these leadership companies that always had been at the table when the state government needed help or wanted something done. That must have been a challenge also in the sort of nonprofit business community and sort of keeping your membership, keeping the revenue going.
And getting new members.
Sure.
A lot of them, it just wasn't there. It's a very difficult, even today, the State Chamber and all organizations like it are having problems because a lot of the companies naturally are merging together, and instead of having 5 banks or 6 banks, they now have maybe, of those 5 or 6 banks, there's only 1 bank.
Mm-hmm. And we also, I guess, have today the reaction toward, again, a cycle of headlines of corruption and involvement of some business people, usually on the local level, with politicians, that has led to a series of new sort of legislative and regulatory proposals on financial disclosures, conflicts of interest. To some extent, has this also soured the business community's sort of view of, participating in a volunteer position on a board or a commission or a task force? I mean, is it becoming more difficult and sort of negative for high-level executives to sort of fill the roles that you discussed, I think, earlier in our talk?
No, believe it or not, I still serve on the board as an ex officio, but I'm on the board of directors of the state chamber. And they're still getting the top people of the companies here in New Jersey. They just, for example, put on the president of the Rutgers University. And they are getting top people, the head of AT&T New Jersey's on our board. And I could go down the whole list, and it reads like a who's who of the present leadership in New Jersey. And there are other men and women who want to get on the state. At one time, there were no women on the state chamber board. Mm-hmm. This has gone back years. But now, we have men and women, and they're very, very successful people. And most of them are CEOs of their companies. Mm-hmm. Maybe not major companies, but very successful companies.
Beyond the state chamber and the other sort of leading business organizations in New Jersey, but what about sort of executives serving, for example, on the boards of hospitals or nonprofits? There are new regulations now on conflicts of interest, which I believe say that if a executive's company does business with, say, a state university and they serve as a trustee, that's a conflict of interest. I believe Verizon New Jersey, for example, CEO resigned from the board of the University of Medicine and Dentistry because the phone company obviously sells service to the university.
Yeah.
I mean, have we gone too far?
I think because we're caught up in this terrible situation of conflicts of interest on a national level, the Enron case and things like this. This has been coming on, and maybe they have gone too far, but I really can't judge it right now. I think we have to give it time. But you have a very good point.
Looking back, I guess, somewhat in conclusion, are you still, as much an optimist? I mean, we have in the state now a lot of the same issues that we dealt with over the course of your lifetime. We have very prominent sort of stories of corruption. We have, again, a fiscal crisis, questions about whether New Jersey can afford the government that we're paying for. And we have, I think, feeling that the younger people are sort of disaffected by government and public service. With all these sort of negative things out there, I mean, do you still think that there's a brighter future coming?
Yes. I'm an optimist when it comes to business and government. I just feel that the new governor has a tremendous task in front of him, John Corzine. But I think, given the right people that he's put around him, I think he's going to do a good job. I think he's the man of the hour at this particular time. I hope I'm correct in that statement. As far as the business community is concerned, I feel that 95% of the business community are honest people and want to do a good job. So, as you can see, I've never belonged to the Optimist Club, but I'm a great optimist, not only for the cities and the towns, but the state of New Jersey and all its inhabitants. I think we have a great state, and I think we have a great future. I know we have a terrible problem with our tax problem, and I hear people, I was at a breakfast today, one gentleman says, I'm moving out of the state because of the high taxes. That's what he said, but I doubt him very much. He wanted me to hear it for a reason. But there are people moving out of the state because of the high taxes, but I feel in the long run, we're going to be all right.
Well, on that positive note, let's close unless there's any closing comments that you wanted to make.
No, I just hope and pray that God gives Brendan Byrne a long and fruitful life.
Thank you.